Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are doing something really important. We're untangling the incredibly messy, conflicting data surrounding U.S. military casualties in the recent conflict with Iran. I'm going to guide you through this, because if there's one thing that absolutely demands clarity, it's the human cost of conflict. We're going to stick strictly to the data, comparing official reports with independent investigations, to try and figure out what's really going on with these shifting numbers.
Okay, let's jump right into our agenda. We've got 5 key areas to cover. First, shifting the casualty count. Second, asking whether this is 2 wars or 1. Third, diving into the hidden human toll. Fourth, comparing conflicting claims and discrepancies. And finally, looking beyond the battlefield.
So, Part 1. Shifting the casualty count.
Right now, the U.S. military's casualty tracking system is under a massive microscope from journalists and independent watchdogs, and we really need to understand why. The core mystery that outlets like The Intercept and CNN are chasing is this: is the United States quietly rewriting the human toll of this war? You know, when databases change quietly behind the scenes, it naturally raises eyebrows. It leaves us asking if Washington is just reorganizing data or if the true cost is actually being hidden.
And look, the accusations here are extremely serious. According to The Intercept, an unnamed U.S. government official flat out stated that the new reporting system from the Department of War is a deliberate attempt to conceal the facts. They called it an effort to obscure the count of the wounded. I mean, that is a wildly heavy allegation coming from inside the government itself.
But, to be totally fair, we have to look at the official response. The Department of War swiftly and aggressively countered this narrative. Spokesperson Shaw Parnell completely shut down claims of a cover-up, calling the reports baseless and malicious. The Pentagon's stance is simply that they are categorizing the data correctly based on operational theaters. Let's map out how this builds over time. The strikes kick off on February 28th, right? Then we hit a 40-day ceasefire starting on April 7th. But look at July 7th. That is when we see renewed casualties. And crucially, it's the exact moment a brand new reporting method is rolled out. That specific gap and the sudden shift in how things are reported is pretty much ground zero for all this current confusion.
Which brings us to Part 2. 2 wars or 1? So the mechanical question here is how the Pentagon actually changed its accounting. How do you split a conflict on paper? Well, under the new system, they physically divided the data. Casualties from the early days, February 28th to April 7th, are logged directly under Operation Epic Fury. But any troops killed or wounded since the July 7th resurgence, they aren't put there anymore. Instead, they get funneled into a much broader, vaguer category called overseas operations. And this perfectly illustrates that divide. Out of a combined 642 casualties, you've got 14 killed and 417 wounded sitting under Epic Fury. Completely separated from that, you have 4 killed and 207 wounded filed under overseas operations. Critics are essentially arguing that this is a political maneuver. They're accusing the Trump administration of chopping one continuous war into 2 separate operations, maybe to keep the full human cost out of the public eye. Making things even more chaotic, the Defense Casualty Analysis System database has been fluctuating wildly. Just look at these numbers. On July 21st, early casualties were suddenly revised down from 500 to 431. Back in April, the wounded count dropped by 15. More recently, 140 previously missing personnel were just added to the count. And in a really bizarre twist, 4 killed soldiers temporarily vanished from the database entirely before reappearing. All of this is happening without any clear, public explanation from the Pentagon other than blaming it on temporary data disruptions.
All right, Part 3. The hidden human toll.
Let's step away from the spreadsheets and the bureaucracy for a second and ground ourselves in the very real, physical cost of these strikes. Because behind every fluctuating digit is a real service member. According to in-depth reporting by ABC News, traumatic brain injury, or TBI, has emerged as the absolute defining wound of this conflict. We're talking about injuries caused by the massive concussive blasts of drone and missile strikes. They don't always leave a visible scar, but trust me, the physical and psychological trauma is profound.
To put the scale of this into perspective, at least 170 American service members have suffered head trauma during these attacks. When you factor in that ABC News was reviewing a total of 653 wounded troops, that means TBIs represent a massive, disproportionate chunk of the overall casualties.
And when you dig into nearly 400 specifically examined cases in that report, the data shows exactly who is taking the hits. U.S. Army personnel have borne the absolute brunt of this, accounting for more than 270 of those documented injuries. That completely dwarfs the other military branches combined.
But it's not just frontline enlisted troops. The data highlights a surprisingly heavy toll on senior military leadership, too. We're talking about 64 Army officers wounded, including captains and lieutenant colonels. 2 U.S. generals even suffered TBIs. The records also show that a staggering 40% of all injuries happened during huge spikes on March 1st and March 18th. And what sparked that? Well, that rapid escalation directly followed a U.S. airstrike that killed Iran's top security official, Ali Larijani. Actions have reactions, and the data maps that out flawlessly.
Part 4. Conflicting claims and discrepancies.
So we've looked at the internal U.S. data. Now we have to neutrally examine the external figures, because in the fog of war, the truth is usually hiding somewhere between vastly different narratives. The official Pentagon numbers currently sit at 704 total personnel killed or wounded across both phases. But an independent investigation by The Intercept, which specifically looked for casualties missing from official figures, suggests the real number could be over 900. If that's accurate, it's a massive disparity in how casualties are being acknowledged.
Adding a whole other layer to this dispute are the claims coming out of Iran itself. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claims over 200 American troops were killed during what they call Operation Nasr II, along with 8 deployment centers and 20 hangars destroyed. The U.S. military, as you might expect, vehemently rejects these numbers, officially putting the death toll at 18. Talk about a stark contrast. It just goes to show how fiercely contested the absolute basic facts of this conflict truly are.
Finally, Part 5. Beyond the battlefield.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really need to talk about the lasting effects of these injuries. The cost of a conflict isn't just paid on the day of a strike. It's paid for decades afterward by the veterans. And data from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs reveals a really heartbreaking statistic. Veterans living with traumatic brain injuries are nearly twice as likely to die by suicide. What you really need to take away from this is that a TBI isn't just a headache you sleep off. It is a long-term vulnerability that these service members carry with them for the rest of their lives.
The Pentagon has frequently told the public that most personnel injured since July 7th returned to duty with what they call minor concussions. But veterans advocates are quick to point out a very crucial reality. Returning to duty does not erase an injury. It certainly doesn't erase the massive scale of the physical trauma inflicted by these attacks, which, as we've seen, far exceeded what the public was initially told.
So, as official casualty numbers climb past 600, 700, and potentially even higher, and as these government databases continue to quietly shift around, we are left with a pretty profound question. As this conflict grinds into its 6th month, how will the full, long-term human cost of this war ultimately be measured, accounted for, and honestly explained to the public? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.